everybody, welcome back to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm your host, Shannon Rogers, and this is my shop. When I first started working entirely by hand, I realized that I needed to find some efficiencies to help me get through projects a little bit faster. In the power tool days, I would mill up all my parts, flat and square on 4 sides, and I would usually cross-cut them to exact length. So essentially, I would have a piece of lumber that was surfaced and square on 6 faces. Well, that takes a lot of work when you're working by hand. So you need to look for these efficiencies in ways that you can make little shortcuts, if you will, that will speed up your work. Things that you might have done in the power tool side of things really just aren't necessary when you're working entirely by hand. If you identify what those are and skip them, you'll find just how much faster your work goes working entirely by hand. I think these are some of the secrets that our forefathers understood that allowed them to work so bloody fast. One of these efficiency areas is when you're working with large timbers like this. I've spent the time to flatten a face and get another parallel face and square and parallel edges. So I've got an S4S piece here. However, when it comes to putting tenons on the end, I usually need some sort of flat surface down here that I can reference in the tenon shoulder. But you can see there's a substantial amount of wood here, and I can't really put this on a shooting board. So I could go through the effort of squaring this whole thing up, and then I've got to square up all the ends of the other 3 pieces, and there's a lot of time there. However, I know that the tenon needs to be 2.5 inches long. At least the mortise is going to be 2.5 inches deep. So I can just measure in 2.5 inches, but I don't know that this is going to be the perfect reference area. So what I'm going to do is measure in a little more than 2.5 inches. We'll say 2 5/8 of an inch. And I'll make a tick mark there. Grab my square, working off my reference edge, and I'll square that line across. Now this is the shoulder line of my tenon, and my tenon length is slightly longer than what I'm going to need. So I can always trim that tenon length later, especially once I've removed all this extra wood and I've got a much narrower tenon. It's much, much easier to true that up. Plus, this surface doesn't have to be perfectly square because it's going to be buried down in the mortise, and I like to leave a little bit of room for glue squeeze out anyway. What does need to be flat and square is the mating joint, the shoulder right here. So now this is my new reference surface. So what I'll do is take it, put it down alongside my other 2 pieces. And these all need to have the shoulders perfectly even so that when they meet the feet, I can work off this reference point to lay out other things along these posts. So I'm just going to kind of roughly line them up along the bottom. Again, my edges are not perfectly square. A couple of these cuts are a little bit out of plumb. Doesn't really matter. Bring them all together. So now I'm going to run a clamp across all 3 pieces. And I'll just put another one up on this other end just for good measure. Keep them nice and firm. And now I can take the line that I already established in my layout square, run that line all the way across. Now I have that reference line, that reference shoulder line, transferred across all 3 pieces, and it's exactly the same. So as long as I reference from this line up my post, they'll all work out the same. Instead of referencing off this bottom, which is not quite square and not quite flat because I didn't bother to go through shooting it. This just saved me probably 30 minutes of working with a block plane on really tough end grain. As I go and lay out some of the other joinery, like the points further up where my treadle rails will run across, I can measure from this point and continue to transfer my lines all the way across. So generally, while the posts are clamped together like this, I'll lay out all the joinery off on the entire piece, referencing off this bottom line. In this example, I've got the 3 feet of my treadle lathe all clamped up together. This was done the same way. This front edge is not a reference surface. I'm just going to be sawing in a molded profile on the front. So all I did was lay out the location of one of these mortises somewhere in the center. I then transferred my lines across so that I could lay out all the other mortises when it was clamped together. That way all the other mortises would be in line. So now when I clamp everything back up and I line up my mortises, I can lay out the other end. This is somewhat of a reference surface because I'll have 3 uprights bridle jointed into the end, and of course they need to line up as well. So I know that the piece that I'm going to joint in here is 2 inches thick. So the shoulder for my bridle joint needs to be at least 2 inches. Since this length is not really that important, you know, it could be 15 inches long, it could be 14 inches long, it doesn't really matter for the design. All I'm going to do is measure from the back of the mortise the shortest dimension, and that's this leg here, at 14 3/4 inches. I'm going to come in 2 inches for the joint that I need to, the bridle joint that I need to put there. And I'm going to come in maybe a 1/16 greater heavy of that 2-inch mark. So this distance is greater than 2 inches, greater than the thickness of the piece I need to join to it. The distance here is going to be longer, the distance here is going to be longer. All that means is once I've cut the bridle joint, I can just flush the back of that up, yet the front shoulder will all be perfectly in line, because while they are clamped together as one unit, I can square this line across. Now I can transfer this line around each piece individually, but knowing that this as my reference line is completely lined up on all 3 of the pieces means that when I come to cut my bridle joints and I assemble them, my uprights will all be perfectly in line. I didn't have to go and worry about shooting these ends, getting these pieces exactly the length, and getting them perfectly flat and usable as a reference surface, nor did I have to do it on the other end. Shooting end grain on a large board like this is a lot of work. It's not something you can really do on a shooting board. So just skip it. Save yourself some time and lay out your joinery lines some arbitrary distance from the end that you know will match your jointed piece. Of course, with that primary reference face laid out, you can then transfer your lines all the way around, lay out your joinery, and start sawing away. And you know that once you're done cutting all your joints, it's going to perfectly line up because you use that shoulder as your reference point. Now this is working obviously really well on large, heavy, big timbers like this, but it'll work on your average 3/4 inch stock as well. If you want to skip shooting the ends and just lay out your joinery a distance slightly greater than the known length of that tenon, you're fine. Although I will tell you that if you're working with 3/4 or 1 inch stock, you can just quickly throw it on a shooting board and you'll be squared and you can use that as a reference face. This is just one of those many things that will allow you to kind of skip a step and save some time getting right to the joinery. I'm sure there are a lot more that just will come by, frankly, being lazy and trying to find ways to skip things. I'd love to hear any of your shortcuts and efficiencies you come up with working by hand. Leave them in the comments below. And thanks for watching, guys.